They did more than hurt you. They slowly dismantled the very person who would have done almost anything to support them. When you pour your loyalty, attention, energy, and heart into a narcissistic relationship, you can become far more than a partner in their eyes. You can become a source of emotional stability they secretly depend on. And this is where the story takes a darker turn. The moment they choose to destroy the person who provided that stability, they may also create consequences for themselves. They may believe they have won because they walked away, humiliated you, or watched you struggle. But what they cannot see is that destroying a dependable source of genuine connection can expose the emptiness they were trying to avoid. What looks like victory on the outside can become the beginning of a much deeper internal struggle. Before looking at what may happen inside them, you need to turn the attention back toward yourself. Think about how exhausted you became trying to keep everything together. Remember the confusion, the constant second-guessing, and that strange emptiness that appeared after giving more and more of yourself. Ask yourself honestly, how much of who I was did I silence just to keep this person comfortable? Think about the warning signs you explained away, the boundaries you surrendered, and the opinions you swallowed because you were afraid of their reaction. That question can become more important than every affectionate word they once gave you or every cruel statement they later used against you. Their apparent confidence may have looked powerful, but confidence and superiority are not always evidence of inner strength. Sometimes they are defenses covering deep insecurity. And when those defenses begin to crack, the person behind the performance can become much harder for even themselves to face. When someone with strong narcissistic traits begins devaluing a partner, it can feel like a judgment of your worth. But often, the shift has more to do with what your presence represents to them. In the beginning, your stability, patience, kindness, and consistency may have felt incredibly attractive because those qualities provided something they struggled to create internally. Your calmness made the relationship feel secure. Your loyalty made them feel important. But eventually, those same qualities can become uncomfortable because they highlight the contrast between your emotional consistency and their internal instability. The more they depend on you, the more vulnerable they may feel. And vulnerability is something a person obsessed with control may experience as weakness. Instead of admitting that they need connection, they may begin protecting their ego by creating distance, criticism, contempt, or emotional coldness. This is when the entire story can suddenly be rewritten. The affection that once made you feel valued becomes something they describe as unnecessary. Your desire for communication becomes neediness. Your request for respect becomes pressure. Your boundaries become control. Even the qualities that once attracted them can suddenly become reasons to criticize you. Your empathy may be called oversensitivity. Your reliability may be dismissed as dullness. Your patience may be treated as weakness. This isn't simply a change in mood. It can become a gradual attack on your perception of yourself. They distance themselves emotionally while still expecting access to your attention, energy, support, and resources. You begin carrying the relationship almost entirely while being made to feel as though you are somehow responsible for its failure. The cruelest part is that you can eventually start believing the accusations. Gaslighting deepens that confusion because the problem is no longer only how they treat you. The problem becomes the story they encourage you to believe about yourself. Little by little, you may begin questioning your memory, your judgment, your intentions, and even your right to be hurt. You start wondering whether you really were too emotional, too demanding, too difficult, or somehow responsible for the treatment you received. But their ability to make you doubt yourself does not determine your actual worth. A confident and emotionally grounded person is much harder to manipulate than someone who constantly needs external approval. That is why your shrinking can become so important within a controlling dynamic. If you are confused enough, desperate enough, and focused enough on getting their approval, they remain at the center of your emotional world. But the moment you begin standing firmly on your own feet, the illusion of their power starts losing its grip. Their influence becomes weaker when your identity no longer depends on their validation. The betrayal can feel especially devastating because the person hurting you may know exactly where you are most vulnerable. Think back to the beginning, when trust was being built and everything seemed unusually safe. You shared personal experiences, childhood pain, private fears, insecurities, dreams, and parts of yourself that you rarely revealed to anyone. You believed those conversations were creating intimacy. You believed you were allowing another person to understand you more deeply. Yet when someone later uses those private disclosures against you, it can feel like the very foundation of trust has been turned into a weapon. The deepest wounds are often not created by random criticism. They come from having something you revealed in confidence later used to embarrass, shame, threaten, or destabilize you. That experience can make you question whether the closeness you felt was ever as genuine as you believed. When emotional attacks repeatedly target your most sensitive areas, your entire system can begin operating from a state of constant alertness. The person who was supposed to feel like a safe place now becomes someone whose mood you constantly monitor. You notice the smallest change in their expression. You study the tone of their voice. You wonder what a short reply means. You analyze their silence. You begin predicting reactions before you even speak. Eventually, you become highly skilled at avoiding conflict, but that skill comes at a painful cost. You start editing your personality, hiding your opinions, changing your behavior, and making yourself smaller to prevent another emotional explosion. You may tell yourself that you are simply trying to keep the peace, but there is a difference between maintaining peace and abandoning yourself to avoid someone else's reaction. When your hobbies, friendships, confidence, and sense of joy disappear piece by piece, the relationship is taking far more from you than you realize. And the most painful part is that the target keeps moving. You believe that if you can become more patient, more understanding, more loving, or more careful, things will finally settle down. So you work harder. You explain yourself more clearly. You apologize for things you did not do. You try to anticipate every possible trigger. Yet somehow the standard changes again. What satisfied them yesterday is suddenly not enough today. That can create an exhausting psychological trap because you keep assuming there must be some version of yourself that will finally make the relationship safe. But if the dynamic depends on control, there may never be a final version of you that earns permanent approval. This is where cognitive dissonance becomes so powerful. Your mind is trying to reconcile two realities that appear impossible to fit together. And the effort of doing so can leave you mentally and emotionally drained. One part of you remembers the person from the beginning. You remember the attention, affection, warmth, promises, long conversations, and moments when you genuinely believed you had finally found someone who understood you. You remember the version of them who seemed caring and deeply connected to you. Yet another part of you is staring at someone who now appears distant, dismissive, critical, or deliberately cruel. Your mind struggles to understand how both versions can belong to the same person. So naturally, it searches for an explanation. And one of the easiest explanations to accept is that you must have caused the change. You start telling yourself, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Maybe I should have been more patient. Maybe I should have acted differently. Instead of questioning the entire dynamic, you investigate yourself for evidence of what went wrong. You can become so focused on finding your own mistake that you turn yourself into the suspect, the investigator, and the judge at the same time. You replay conversations, analyze messages, remember arguments, and search through old memories, looking for the exact moment when everything supposedly changed. You may convince yourself that if you discover the right mistake, you can correct it and bring the loving version of that person back. But this internal battle does not mean you are weak or incapable of understanding relationships. It means your mind is desperately trying to create order from something that feels contradictory and unpredictable. Your brain wants a clear cause and effect. Good behavior should produce love, honesty should produce trust, and loyalty should produce loyalty in return. When reality violates those expectations, the mind can struggle to accept what it is seeing. The confusion is not proof that you failed. It is evidence of how deeply the relationship affected your perception of reality. You are trying to understand someone through ordinary human logic, empathy, and emotional reciprocity, while they may be approaching the relationship through control, dominance, and self-protection. The security they gave you at the beginning may have felt genuine, but in a toxic dynamic, that sense of safety can sometimes become part of the setup that encourages you to open up completely. You trusted them with your vulnerabilities, and later, those same vulnerabilities were used against you. That does not mean you failed at love. It means you became caught inside a pattern that existed before you entered their life. They may not have suddenly transformed into someone cruel. You may simply have reached the point where the image they maintained could no longer be sustained. Once you understand that their attacks are not proof of your defects, the confusion begins to loosen its grip. The most unsettling part often comes immediately after the conflict. You may be devastated, crying, shaking, or desperately trying to understand how someone could treat you that way while the other person appears completely unaffected. Sometimes they even seem unusually relaxed, confident, energized, or almost pleased with themselves. That contrast can make you question your own perception. You wonder how someone who just caused so much pain can sit there as though nothing significant happened. In certain narcissistic dynamics, your visible distress can reinforce their sense of power because it confirms that they were able to affect you deeply. Your emotional reaction becomes evidence in their mind that they still have influence. The more desperate you become for an explanation, the more powerful they may feel. What feels like emotional devastation to you can therefore become a distorted form of validation for them. This is also why they may behave as though the argument never happened. Instead of processing what they did, they can dismiss the entire event, minimize your pain, or shift attention toward your reaction. Suddenly, the conversation is no longer about what they said or did. It becomes about why you are crying, why you are upset, or why you cannot simply move on. By focusing on your response, they avoid examining their own behavior. If they can persuade you that you are too sensitive, irrational, dramatic, or unstable, they no longer have to confront the consequences of their actions. That creates a convenient escape from accountability. But the appearance of emotional invulnerability should not be mistaken for genuine strength. Avoiding guilt does not resolve the underlying problem. Suppressing responsibility may protect an ego temporarily, but it does not create emotional maturity, stability, or genuine connection. What looks like a victory can ultimately become a very empty form of satisfaction. If someone repeatedly relies on attention, admiration, control, or emotional reactions from others to regulate their sense of importance, the effect may not last very long. Once the emotional intensity fades, they may begin looking for another source of stimulation or validation. This can create a repetitive cycle in which increasingly dramatic interactions are needed to recreate the same sense of power. Meanwhile, the deeper emotional issues remain untouched. Instead of confronting insecurity, shame, emptiness, or fear, they keep searching for another person to temporarily silence those feelings. From the outside, this can look like confidence and freedom. Internally, however, constantly needing another reaction to feel powerful can leave a person trapped in an exhausting pattern. The high never becomes permanent because external validation can never permanently repair an internal void. And this is where losing you can matter more than they initially realize. You are not simply another person in their life. You may have provided years of consistency, patience, emotional understanding, encouragement, and reassurance. You may have continued showing up even during moments when they gave very little back. That steady presence can become something a person takes for granted, precisely because it is so reliable. They assume it will always be available. So when they finally push it away, they may believe another person can easily fill the same role. On the surface, they might quickly move toward someone new. They may seem excited, liberated, and completely unaffected by your absence. But replacing a person is not the same as replacing the history, trust, familiarity, and emotional investment that existed between you. A new connection can provide stimulation, but it cannot instantly recreate years of shared experience. Novelty can create excitement, but excitement should never be confused with depth. Someone new may admire the image they present because they have not yet witnessed the contradictions behind it. Fresh attention can feel intoxicating because there is no history of conflict, disappointment, or accountability attached to it. But eventually, every new relationship reaches a point where the performance becomes harder to maintain. The initial praise loses its intensity. The attention becomes familiar. The excitement settles. If the underlying emotional pattern has not changed, the same dissatisfaction can return. Then another source of stimulation may be sought. It becomes a cycle of chasing something new whenever the old emotional high disappears. Imagine trying to fill a container that has a hole in the bottom. No matter how much you pour into it, the level never stays where you want it. External attention may temporarily cover the emptiness, but it cannot permanently remove it. Eventually, the person may begin experiencing a restlessness that no new relationship can completely resolve. They move from one interaction to another, constantly looking for something that will recreate the feeling they once had. Yet every new connection eventually becomes ordinary. An ordinary connection requires something deeper than charm or performance. It requires vulnerability, accountability, consistency, and the ability to tolerate emotional intimacy. Without those qualities, the cycle simply repeats. Meanwhile, you may have been the person who offered something much more substantial than temporary excitement. You offered continuity. You knew their history. You understood their patterns. You remained present through difficult periods. Losing that kind of connection can create a very different absence from simply losing attention. They may never openly acknowledge it, but the difference between being surrounded by people and genuinely feeling connected to someone can eventually become impossible to ignore. While they remain caught in whatever cycle they have created, something completely different can begin happening inside you. At first, your healing may not feel powerful at all. It may feel like grief. You are not only mourning the relationship that ended, you are mourning the future you imagined, the promises you believed, and the version of the person you thought you were building a life with. You may miss the kindness you remember from the beginning. You may grieve the person you believed would protect you, understand you, and stand beside you. This kind of grief is complicated because you are saying goodbye to both a relationship and an expectation. Your heart is slowly accepting what another part of you may have understood much earlier. And acceptance rarely arrives all at once. It often begins quietly through the realization that continuing to reach for the same person is keeping the wound open. Eventually, you stop automatically reaching for your phone whenever something happens. You no longer feel the same urge to tell them every detail of your day. You stop rehearsing explanations in your head, trying to discover the perfect combination of words that will finally make them understand your pain. That is a major shift. The silence that once felt unbearable begins to feel different. Instead of being a punishment or a desperate attempt to get their attention, it becomes a space where you can finally hear yourself again. Without constantly monitoring their reactions, you have room to notice your own thoughts. You begin remembering what you like, what you believe, what you want, and what you had sacrificed. The absence that once felt like emptiness slowly becomes room for recovery. And little by little, the emotional noise becomes quieter. Then something even more powerful develops: clarity. You stop explaining away behavior that repeatedly hurt you. You stop telling yourself that they were simply stressed, wounded, tired, misunderstood, or having a difficult day every single time they crossed another line. You begin looking at the entire pattern instead of analyzing each incident separately. You see the repetition. You notice the same cycle of affection, withdrawal, criticism, confusion, and reconciliation appearing again and again. This recognition can be painful because it forces you to stop negotiating with reality. You realize that individual apologies cannot erase a repeated pattern. You understand that good moments do not automatically cancel harmful ones. And perhaps most importantly, you stop measuring their intentions and start paying attention to their behavior. What matters is not the explanation they give for what they did. What matters is what they repeatedly choose to do. That realization can feel like a devastating punch because it challenges the story you built around the relationship. You may have believed you were fighting to save something rare and meaningful. You may have spent months or years trying to bring back the loving version of the person you met at the beginning. But eventually, you may recognize that you were trying to preserve an image that no longer matched the reality in front of you. That does not mean every positive moment was necessarily fake, but it does mean the relationship cannot be judged only by its best moments. When someone repeatedly causes harm and then expects you to ignore the pattern, you are being asked to sacrifice reality for hope. And you cannot heal by endlessly trying to repair an imagined version of someone. Freedom begins when you stop trying to resurrect what the relationship consistently proves it cannot become. This is where your power begins returning to you, not because you finally defeated them, not because they regret losing you, and not because they suddenly recognize your value, but because you stop making their recognition necessary. Your attention begins moving away from their behavior and back toward your own life. You start listening to the quiet instincts you once dismissed. Those moments when something inside you whispered that a situation was wrong no longer seem irrational. The discomfort you ignored starts making sense in hindsight. You understand that your boundaries were not unreasonable demands designed to control another person. They were protective limits that existed to preserve your dignity, emotional safety, and sense of self. You were not selfish for needing respect. You were not difficult for wanting honesty. You were not asking for too much simply because someone made basic emotional needs feel inconvenient. Your boundaries were the lines that helped you remember where they ended and where you began. You stop waiting for someone else to approve your need for respect, and you begin deciding for yourself what you will and will not accept. All the energy you once spent studying their moods, interpreting every message, and anticipating their reactions starts returning to you. Instead of trying endlessly to repair someone who refuses to confront their own behavior, you begin repairing the relationship you have with yourself. You finally recognize that you were the one person who remained with you through every painful moment. This change is something a controlling person may never have expected. The entire dynamic depended on the assumption that you would always remain available, always keep waiting, and always accept whatever small amount of affection was offered. They expected you to remain trapped in uncertainty, but they underestimated what happens when someone reaches their limit and finally chooses themselves. You are not simply getting over the relationship. You are becoming more aware, more discerning, and far less willing to ignore what you once tolerated. You begin recognizing familiar tactics without needing someone to explain them to you. The mixed signals, sudden affection, emotional withdrawal, guilt, and manipulation that once left you confused can eventually become obvious. You can look at those behaviors and see how repetitive they really were. They no longer carry the same mystery or emotional power. The most important shift happens when you stop longing for the person you imagine them to be and accept the person their repeated actions revealed. That is when the attachment begins losing its grip. You are not merely escaping a painful situation. You are returning to your own life, your own identity, and your own values. And this time, you are making a conscious decision not to abandon yourself just to keep someone else close. Eventually, they may attempt to reopen communication and pull you back into the familiar dynamic. It can begin with something incredibly ordinary, a casual question, a random message, a reference to an old memory, or a sudden apology that sounds remarkably close to everything you once wished they would say. Because you have been waiting for acknowledgement, that message can feel powerful. But instead of immediately interpreting it as proof of change, look at the larger pattern. A message is not transformation. An apology is not automatically accountability.